Lovely. Morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me in the back. My name's Andy Wells, and for the last, since 1988, I have had the pleasure of messing around with satellite imagery. That means two things. One, I'm old and I've started to actually look at what the hell my pensions are doing, pretty much for the first time over the last couple of years. And the second is, it's given me a bit of perspective over the way that Earth observation has evolved and developed. But more interestingly, is it valuable? Because my entire work has been commercial. Always outreach, always talking to customers, always looking to fix problems. And that cycle over the last 30 years or so has proved to be hugely profitable and valuable in some cases, and a complete unmitigated disaster in others. And so what I want to do is share perhaps a bit of a balanced view of what's happened before, but most interestingly, sort of where we are now, and to answer the question above, as long as I don't, one day I will get done for copyright on the title. So, excellent. So a bit of a structure to the talk. I am going to wander through the holy grail, if you like, working from that sort of raw data and satellite side, generating information from it, which leads hopefully to knowledge, and knowledge over time is wisdom on how to use that information in the appropriate way. So, that is what I used to get when I asked for a satellite image 30 years ago. I mean, it's a cheat, right? I did get an image, there was actually no signal, but it was awful, right? It was in a format I didn't understand. It was hopefully in the place I asked it for, but often it wasn't, pointed in the wrong place. Trying to correct it to the Earth's surface was an absolute nightmare. And when I finally got there, I'd filled up my entire hard drive, so I had no space to actually do anything with it. And those early problems started to fix themselves, and we all started to get excited about it, started applying it to real-world problems, and so we started looking at other places, lovely Manchester, and think, right, we have a project, job done, we bought the data, and it looked like that. And therein lied the problem. There was so little data from so few satellites, trying to actually get the raw information was a mare. And in fact, Manchester was a particular good example. I worked for Airbus for some time. We had a project for one map, one image map of the whole of the UK, quite a long time ago, and it took us 4.5 years. It took us 1.5 years to get everywhere, and 3 years to get Manchester, basically. Statistically, because you could only try and get an image every 6 days or so. And that's where we were. And then, frankly, all hell broke loose. And this is now happening in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Instead of launching buses into space, and that size is pretty equivalent, and there are still 1 or 2 being launched, we started launching shoeboxes. Expensive shoeboxes, but the cross comparison in price, you're looking at some tens of thousands of dollars. But more importantly, you could put 10 or 20 of them on one launcher. Because actually the satellites are expensive, but launch tends to be the more expensive component. And what did that do? Well, it started changing the game somewhat. You start with resolution, so 30-meter resolution data, down to 10 meter, down to 5 meter, and this is a slightly old slide, referencing a sort of 50 centimetre, down to 32 centimetre, and now, with clever analytics, you can pretty much get down to 15 and 20 centimetre data. So you're starting to see the objects that you want, so the quality is there, and then you actually, sorry, just bear with me one moment. Yeah, good. Apologies. But there was also a matter of what you could see. So for those who played and understand satellite imagery, it's not like your human eye. So your eye sees red, green, blue, and that's still a fundamentally valuable deliverable, top left, because you fundamentally understand the objects you're looking at. But one of the advantages of satellite data since almost day one is it sees other things, near infrared. So top right, that's an bunch of agricultural fields in the US, and the red bits, to use the technical term, that's actually the reflectance in near infrared. And that's important because when plants photosynthesize, one of the byproducts is energy in that wavelength. So if your plants are happy, and they're growing, and they're lovely, and they're going to give you a nice crop, they look nice and red, and if they're not happy, they don't. So you can start to see the potential applications, seeing those other wavelengths. And then you're starting to get the resolutions, and the one on the bottom right, that was actually taken at 1 a.m. in the morning at night time. Because we're starting to use radar. And radar isn't a passive sensor. It doesn't need the sun's energy reflecting off the earth and measure it. It's an active sensor, and it's banging out signals, and it's measuring the response. So it doesn't need sunlight. And in fact, it's not too bothered about cloud either. And that's also a big advantage. So it sees some objects that you don't see, it sees at night, and it's starting to loosen up the challenges and problems of getting the data in the first place. Going back to launches, so data quality is going up, what it's seeing is going up, and now what about the number of them? It's an interesting graph, and actually it's a bit old, but I can tell you the graph is still going in the right way. This is the number of launches annually of objects into space. Now, in fairness, that graph has got a disease. It's called Elon Muskitis. Because in fairness, that graph is dominated by SATCOM, so communication satellites. And that's most of the objects that are being thrown up. But underneath that graph, there has been a proportionally equivalent drive on Earth observation satellites. Satellites that are looking at the Earth's surface rather than just looking at communications, etc. So the number of satellites has actually gone explosive in the last few years. And so has, I may add, the number of companies throwing them up. Because all of a sudden you don't need to be a government. And you don't need $10 billion in the bank to plan it, build it, launch it, build your ground segment, keep the satellite in operation for X number of years, and then plan your next set of satellites. And in fact now, if any of you, thinking pensions, are sat on a beautiful pension, you too could be the owner of a very shiny satellite, and you can do it. You can buy the entire thing, the satellite, the sensor, the ground segment, everything off a third party, off the shelf. And those companies are now setting up to just let you do it. And that's led to an interesting outcome, because as soon as the price became right, this beautiful graphic, which you will not be able to read, is a list of every single satellite constellation, so not even individual satellites, so a constellation could be 100 satellites, or 5, or 3, or 1. Every single little line on that spreadsheet, and it took me a little while to sort of try and get it on one sheet, is a planned launch from about 6 months ago for the next only 5 years. And that's been driven by the box in the middle. Corporate investment has got ever so interested very quickly, and they are now pouring money into the marketplace, whereas traditionally governments were the only people who had the money to actually put satellites into space. And the reason they're doing that, venture capitalists, is they fundamentally believe there's money in this game somewhere. So everything is going in the right direction. The quality of data, what it can see, how often you can get it. And yet, and I said I'd try and give you a balanced view, it's not all roses and loveliness in the world of Earth observation. So I just spent a little while ago, a week or so ago, doing a 10-minute search on the downside, and these are some of the press releases that have come up in the last 3 or 4 or 5 months or so. Planet, top left, Maxar, top middle. They are 2 of the very largest data suppliers, raw data suppliers. And financially, they got backers, and the backers aren't that happy. And there's a little bit of, call it reorganisation and rebalancing of the profit and loss, We have two other major problems down, well, actually before I go there, the HotSat is a UK initiative for thermal data. The first time a high-resolution thermal satellite in orbit. 3-metre resolution. Can you look at your house? Can you check every individual loft insulation across the whole UK? Yes, you can. Brilliant application. Really, really interesting. Unfortunately, got into orbit and the sensor didn't work properly. Now they're insured. They'll be back in a year or two, but you might be a commercial organisation in here that spent a year building products on the back of that. And now your entire business plan has been shifted sideways 2 years. So it's not easy. And down the bottom, there's a couple of pretty serious things starting to happen in space. Number one, it's getting busy. There is a finite limit to how many satellites you can put in a particular orbit without them crashing into each other. And if they do crash into each other, they cause an awful lot of debris. And that debris can be tiny, 1 millimetre, but it is travelling at 28,000 miles an hour. And for the physicists in this room, you can do the maths on what happens when you get a tiny little thing moving very quickly through a very expensive, quite sensitive instrument. And so, all I'm suggesting here is, do I think there is a very different place for satellite data now than there was? Unequivocally. Is it worth considering that? Absolutely. But always do it with just an eye on the longevity and whether it will be there in 5 years, 10 years. Fundamentally, I think it will. These problems will be solved, but it's just a warning. So, that's the data. Right? We all know data is a big question is, so what? There have been a huge number of applications from space, and these are just a few. Top left, commodity analysis. Physical amount of oil in oil storage, crude oil, right across the globe. I know of at least 15 projects in actively monitoring estimates of the number of oil being stored in China, oh by the way, and the US and every other country on a regular basis as of now. Top right, just looking at ship movements both in the UK and globally, because some people don't necessarily trust the ship beacons to tell you where particular ships are. Bottom left is individual accounting of palm trees for palm oil prediction. Rather than doing it on a per field basis, it's now down to a per tree basis. And they're busy looking at whether you can do the age of the tree, because that has a fundamental impact on the amount of palm oil it will produce. And bottom right, there's a lovely example of that agricultural example, where you can see within fields the variance in how happy that crop is. And you ask your questions, why? Is it water stress? Is it lack of fertiliser? Is it too much fertiliser? So those applications are all live, and actually, satellites come into their own in interesting circumstances. So we had the unfortunate experience of COVID not so long ago, and all of a sudden the word remote sensing, focused on the word remote, became de rigueur, because you just couldn't go visit something. So these are just 3 or 4 examples, unfortunate ones I may add, but 3 or 4 examples of the way that the old DFID really started ramping its capability. Top left was an oil tanker that was taken over by people who shouldn't be on that oil tanker, and they kept it for a very long time, and it was full of oil, and a load of remote sensing was done on a series of what-ifs. What if it started leaking? Top right was actually monitoring pretty much every day road traffic, particularly raw material transfer, in a country to see how the economy was doing. Because the view was, is if the economy was okay, it was going to remain stable. But if they couldn't get the raw materials, petrol, food, then there was going to be a significant problem. And monitoring one road in one place every day was all they particularly needed. And bottom right, again, is super unfortunate. They are graves. That was trying to understand the impact of COVID in a country where the statistics and the reporting, it just had no idea. And so how do you provide support to a country where you don't know where it's needed? And that focus, that recon word, I'm going to come back to fairly shortly. But, sorry, missed a point. They're projects. They're not programs. Long-going operational day in day. They sort of were for a period of time in the worked, but 5-year, 10-year programs. I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. Now, already been mentioned, AI. Are you ready? Because from an Earth observation perspective, this is in the last 12 months or so, and this is a OMG moment, to use a non-swear word, basically. For me, I've seen 4 or 5 of these in the last 30 years. This is one of the most exciting ones. This is where you apply AI and machine learning to imagery, and you train it, and you look to try and produce intelligence from data. And the reason why I love it so is for 2 reasons: cost and opportunity, because again, I'm a commercial person. So, the first area it's going to have a massive impact on is climate. Climate has now changed the game in a number of areas, and it's called instability. Assets, things you were doing before which were perfectly happy and not a problem, are now a problem. The number of companies looking into their long-reach supply chain has exploded exponentially in the last 24 months because they're not sure they're going to be able to operate like they used to because they just don't know. And trying to get intelligence on things they've never looked at previously is ideal from an Earth observation perspective. But the other area is the magic white bit on maps. Again, another technical term. So we all produce a lot of maps, and an awful lot of them have got white bits, or in the case of master maps, sort of orangey, yellowy bits in terms of what's on the screen here. Now, this is where life is going, and this is a really good example from a company called Geospatial Insight, where they were asked by a client who was doing on-street electric vehicle charging. My enemy is a driveway. If somebody has a driveway, then I have a problem because I'm not going to be able to basically get them to charge on the street. And there are indicators like number of terrace houses, right? That's a good indicator of lack of driveway. So what the company did from the moment they had their first call, it took them 7 weeks and 4 days to generate 22 million driveways from scratch. And in that period of time, they understood the problem. They designed it as a geographer would. What is a driveway? They started working with particularly machine learning AI. They generated the outcome, and it was delivered to the client. And that is where things are going. And once you've got that idea, then top left is 26.5 million rooftops for potential solar. That took them about 2.5 months. Bottom right took them about a month to try and calculate the number of front gardens that are left, having not been paved over, for the driveway, which you need for your electric vehicle so you can charge it, right? Or for any other purpose, because some local authorities charge for on-street. And yet, right, and here's the problem with this, the balance, all of these companies using Pareto's law. This technology is an 80% solution for 20% of the price. Is that driveway map accurate? No, it's not. But it's good enough. And that's another outcome from this evolution of satellite data in space. It may not give you perfection, but it could solve 80% of your problem in 20% of the time for 20% of the cost. So what's the future? It's about services based on things like that huge amount of data, using AI and machine learning to rack through it extremely quickly, and then give the client what they want. In this case, this was a service partnered by Catapult. It's a good example. They built a service looking for oil slicks. It was all automated. You got a warning on WhatsApp. You then clicked a button and got a map of where the potential slick was. You had a meeting. It gave you directions. You sent your boat out. You found the oil slick. You cleaned it up. The end client never got an image. I suppose they got a map in the middle, but that was about it. And if you take that to an extreme, this is using radar data. This is using it to calculate millimetric changes in the Earth's surface on peat bogs, because when you recover a peat bog, it grows, it breathes, it changes in height by 2 millimetres. You can pick that up from space and calculate quite accurately the tons of CO2 estimated that you've managed to stop leaving the peat bog. And that, as a carbon credit, has an exact value. So all of a sudden, you're turning imagery, data, mapping, and all the end client is getting now is a spreadsheet. That is starting to happen more and more in the last 6 months, 12 months, 18 months or so. And yet, you've got to be super careful. Because by just giving the end client a spreadsheet, what's the quality of the data in there exactly? And there are issues and challenges with that, with some companies using satellite data produce bad outcomes. And so, everything everywhere all at once? Maybe. But think partnership. Satellite data on its own is no good. It is good, but it's not as good as if you partner it with geography, geospatial data, local ground-based data, people on the ground if needs be. Right? On its own, it only gives you part of the answer. Think Pareto. It'll give you 80% and 20% of the cost. That is a high net gain, and certainly a tool for that. And priority. Satellite data can often tell you where to look. And then you spend a bit more money and a bit more accuracy on places that you actually want to go to. Because it's a question about nothing. I have found over the last 30 years, more government bodies, academics and commercial people than you can count spending huge amounts of money finding nothing. Because nothing's changed. But it's called Sod's Law. The moment you stop looking at something, it will change, and it will cost you time, effort, money, deaths, whatever it may be. But that cost of nothing is the same price as finding something. And space is pretty damn good at finding nothing. So there are business opportunities coming to the fore. Just being careful and very focused about how you apply satellite data. It is not a panacea, but it's starting to become hugely valuable, certainly over the last few years. On that note, I'll say thank you very much.
So the question is, how important to your commercial customers is sustainable practice in observation, not just application, but in their workflows?
Sustainable commercially or sustainable as a planet environmentally?
Yeah, environmentally.
Environmentally. It is getting increasingly important. So there are large-scale discussions about what is the cost to the planet of launching a satellite versus the value it returns. And that value has only ever been measured commercially, and now there's big questions over, well, what is the benefit of that launch and the cost to the planet of building it and launching it in terms of sustainability? What is it giving back? Those conversations probably started, funnily enough, about 2 or 3 years ago. And there are extremely good cases for some typologies of launches, and then there's questionable ones over others. And it's starting to come out as fairly violent action. There is real teeth to recovering what you're sending up now. Because the use of that low Earth orbit, whatever orbit you use, long term, and just leaving your rubbish up there, which is what the standard practice has been. Some of them dip them into a sort of dropout orbit which will burn them up. All right, that's fine, but others don't bother. That is close to being outlawed. And insurance companies are now starting to stipulate what is your sustainability practice for space. So there's the Earth bit, which is what are you doing for the planet in terms of benefit, but there's also the sustainability of the space bit, because as we mess our planet up, we're now thinking about messing up a big chunk of space as well. Why not, you know? So Has it reached where it needs to be? No. But those conversations, I can tell you now, are pretty heavy, and in some cases being linked to money, and that always wakes people up.
Any other questions for Andy? We'll take one more if there is one.
Hi, thanks very much. I was curious, you mentioned the spreadsheet being given to clients.
Yeah.
But the average public user is seeing satellite data more and more in journalism.
Yes, they are.
I was curious if you could comment on the role of satellite data in journalism writ large.
Let's start with the basics. I know 25 years ago this word image map came up. And there's a lot of companies out there talking about a picture paints 1,000 words, right? And I used that in talks 20 odd years ago, and to an extent it is true. If the reader can interpret the image, you're giving them an image they can understand and then start to look, start to interpret, start to get views on, then it's hugely valuable from that perspective. And there are a number of clients out there, a number of organised companies who want the spreadsheet, but also want access to the imagery as well, so they can verify it. From a wider piece, as long as the source of data is valid, and most satellites are valid, and what they produce is valid, and you can ask for how they processed it, then it tells you what is where and what it might be pretty much anywhere globally. There are now current restrictions, big ones on Ukraine and Israel, I may add, but that's mostly because those bigger sensors are US based and they're very sensitive about giving that data. Other than that, actually you can get imagery of really interesting places, and you can actually look at them, and you know where the data's come from, and you know how it's been processed, and therefore you can feel comfortable that it's giving a realistic, accurate and valid view of the landscape at that time, and then you can decide what it's telling you. Whether something is there, whether it should be there, whether it's not there, where is it going, why might it be going there, all these questions that geographers have been asking themselves for 400 years. I think it has a massive value in that. I may also add, the archives now are huge. So was it there 5 years ago? Actually, that's a brave new world. There are now companies who will sell you 250 metre by 250 metre blocks of an image from 5 years ago at 50 centimetre resolution for £1. Now that's got legs, because it's about what is now, but it's also about, well, how has it changed? And so with all these launches, the commercial models are getting broken apart, the cost is coming down, the availability is going up, and there are a lot of people trust a lot of satellite images, and I think they should be, for most of the suppliers. Sorry, leave me time.
Yeah, last week we'll have to be very...
Go coffee.
Very quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question goes a little bit beyond the commercial, as there are, for example, people who believe in terms of human rights investigations, accountability, and usually one of the main concerns that I've seen is that from the imagery analysis, that commercial barrier to getting high spatial resolution imagery, as it was, for example, trying to go beyond that by using radar data, for example. So I don't know if you would have to comment on that. Maybe radar analysis might have something else to something closer to very high spatial resolution image, or which might be other of the trends that we will.
Yeah, I mean, there are rules and regs over who can buy a satellite image. So if you've got a big company like Maxar, for example, in the US, it's covered under US export law. So that starts with X number of countries who just can't buy the data, right? And then there's layers on top of that about checking, even if it's not that country, where is the data of, and then why you're bearing it. And there are a series of fairly heavy lifting processes, depending on where you're looking, etc., etc. That said, the access to the data for third parties to try and get an independent view of what is really going on, in inverted commas, is pretty good, frankly, if you pass all of the rules and regs about getting the data. How imagery is interpreted, right? Well, of course, that's an opinion. We're back to the joys of cartography, right? Except maybe there aren't a set of rules. So how you look at an image and come to one conclusion and then publish it versus the same image, somebody else comes to a completely different conclusion, that's absolutely feasible. It's like a piece of art at the National Gallery. Two people look at it, one says it's rubbish, the other one starts to see things that maybe the painter didn't even think was there in the first place. So that is always going to be there. However, the availability, and now it's pretty quick to get, pretty cheap to get, you don't need really fancy tools to process it, right? That is starting to commoditize and open it up, not just to governments and big corporations. As I said, you can buy your own satellite as long as you pass the tests. You know, it's down to that level, and getting large amounts of data now is a lot easier than it used to be.
Andy, thank you very much.
It's okay.